Greetings. I am Pearl John from Logos Management, and let me extend a warm welcome to the other 167. I'm delighted that you could join me today as we continue on the series Dare to be a Daniel in the Corporate Den and draw life-transforming lessons from the life of Daniel. Last week we spoke on the theme, what made Daniel, the ordinary young lad, into the extraordinary leader? And we said, 1, he desisted defilement. 2, he was devoted to prayer. And 3, he had a disposition to take risks. This week we move on to the 4th part of the series, and we will focus on the theme, unlocking the power within. Unlocking the power within. I would like us to focus on 3 key facets that are critical lessons from the life of Daniel. 1, testing is a prerequisite for towering. And we find that in verse 13. Tests are often viewed as an irritant. Many tend to become unduly anxious when having to be tested. There is a sense of foreboding and hopelessness that surrounds testing for many. This can have devastating consequences for some as they see tests coming up in the horizon. However, we see a completely different picture of Daniel. In verse 12, we find Daniel asking to be tested. His sense of confidence was so high that he volunteered to be tested. He recognized that if he were to advance, he would need to subject himself to be tested. It was not a single test, but a series of tests. Not a one-day test match, but a day-by-day test series that lasted for 10 days. Not only did he go through a 10-day assessment, he passed with flying colors. You know what? 10 days of testing leads to a 10-fold proficiency. We read in verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king tested Daniel, he found Daniel 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. The assessment was followed up by an interview process. There are a number of IAS aspirants who are petrified of the final interviews. But once they clear the final interviews, they have the best that the government offers. What does it tell you? Interviewing is a prerequisite for increase. We find that in verse 19. So don't shun interviews. Instead, scale yourself up to meet the interviews for the opportunities that opens up post the interviews and takes you to vistas that you never imagined. Secondly, living by convictions invariably yields the coveted crowns. We find that in verse 16. Often, in the short term, living by convictions is likely to result in serious misgivings. But in the longer term, they bring returns that are credible, lasting, and sustainable. There are numerous narratives of people who have chosen to follow their convictions and have reached heights beyond description. Mr. Raja B. Singh, the senior partner of R.K. Khanna and Associates, a former global trustee of Gideon's International and the founder of the Logos Management, chose to live by his convictions early on. In a short documentary of excerpts of his life story, Mr. Singh recounts how he chose to follow the way of Jesus and determined he will not compromise his integrity and rewrite the numbers to suit himself or his client. That conviction and pursuant action has stood him in good stead, whereby his client, who he had a 30% share of the business, channeled 100% of the business to his firm, thanks to the integrity demonstrated. Does your convictions find their way into actions? Be rest assured that the rewards shall come in its time. Thirdly, a clear conscience plus veggies are better than a guilty conscience plus king's delicacies. We find that in verse 15. The story of Macbeth comes to mind as you consider a guilty conscience. For the guilt eats into you, erodes your sense of confidence, and erases your comfort, taking you often to the edge. The guilt of omission or commission can be equally damning. Doing what you ought not to do and not doing what you ought to do can be detrimental to one's sense of well-being. The interesting thing is, you will have people throwing mud at you whether you are guilty or not. But as 1 Peter 3:16 says, keep a clear conscience before God, so that when people throw mud at you, none of it will stick. They'll end up realizing that they are the ones who need a bath. Daniel and his friends chose to have a clear conscience with veggies than a guilty conscience with the delicacies of the king's table. The point to note is that they could have very easily rationalized their actions, saying they were at the mercy of the king's orders and therefore they were forced to eat of the delicacies. But they were conscious of their conscience and did not want to carry the burden of guilt. How often we find people searing their conscience and volitionally choosing the wrong path, pursuing the wrong road, and quelling the tug of their conscience. Not so Daniel. He had determined in his heart not to defile himself. How is your conscience? Is it clear or guilty? If it is guilty, get that guilt cleansed today, so you, like Daniel, can enjoy a guilt-free conscience. This is Pearl John signing off, The Other 167. Thanks for watching The Other 167. Continue to watch and share The Other 167 with others and encourage them to watch. We meet next Friday to continue on this series. Do tune in.